Welcome back to the Dig Into Your Day with Cover Crops and Conservation webinar series. It's been a great series. We have one more week left. Next week, I'll be presenting on Monday about some research we've been doing with cover crops and soybeans in Vermont. And then wrapping that up with another presentation on Thursday focused on soybeans and cover crops with Kara Peterson. She's from the University of Maryland. So we have growing interest in cover cropping into soybeans and after soybeans, and want to spend a little time talking about some strategies. The Eastern Region Soybean Board has been kind enough to support our research in that area. So want to present on some of the work and knowledge we're gaining. So again, welcome this morning. Just a couple of reminders. If you need CCA credits, please send Catherine an email and she'll make sure you get those credits. We will have a quick poll after John and Alexander finish presenting this morning, and we appreciate if you can answer the quick poll. And as everybody knows, put your questions for the speakers in the chat box or the Q&A box, and we'll get to those when the webinar, when our presenters are finished. All right, so we are really thankful this morning to have John Young and his son Alexander here today, this morning. John's a fifth generation Kentucky farmer, and he's been working on his family's farm, or took over his family's farm. Started farming when he was 11, holy moly. So when he was really young, and they've been using no-till farming methods for a very long time and have a lot of experience in this area. His son Alexander is, wow, both of them with BS's from University of Kentucky and Murray State University, and master's degrees from Purdue and the University of Knoxville. So it's great. They're working together, and the rest of their family comes home during the busy season to help out planting, gosh, 2,300 acres of corn, wheat, and soybeans. So they're pretty busy, and I imagine really busy right now. So we appreciate your time this morning to present to the farmers here in Vermont. Thank you very much, John and Alexander, for joining us. And
It's a pleasure to be here.
Yep, that's great. Well, I think we'll turn it over to you. Do you know how to share your screen? Oh, you are. You're an expert here.
Yep. I think we're good. Alexander's the one who's proficient technologically, and I do the talking. So we're going to proceed. We do have a PowerPoint presentation. I'll work our way through it. And Al, feel free to kick in anytime you'd like to join the conversation. I assume you can see that, right?
Yep, we can see your presentation now.
Yeah, we can.
Very good. Our presentation I called The Birth, Infancy, and Adolescence of Modern No-Tillage, simply because I don't think it's matured yet. No-tillage was a great idea. It's an idea whose time had come in the middle of the 20th century, and it's still an idea whose time has come, but there have been so many improvements in the last 55 years or so that I think it's wise to realize that just because we think we know what's going on doesn't mean we really know everything. None of us do. Even those with the most experience don't know everything. In fact, it reminds me of a quotation, one of my favorites, from Thomas Edison, who said, you remember Thomas Edison, of course, one of the greatest inventors the United States has ever produced. When asked about what there was yet to invent or discover, he says, we don't know 1/1,000,000th of 1% of anything. And I think that's true. There are so many unknown secrets yet to be tapped that we are just in the process. So even though we've been no-tilling here in Western Kentucky since 1962, we have a long way to go. We'll talk about some of the advancements, I suppose, as we get along through there, but let's, how do we do this? Okay, here we go. The first picture really references two things. Number one, no tillage has been around since shortly after Adam and Eve left the Garden of Eden. When if anyone who grabbed a stick and poked a hole and stuck in a seed was doing no tillage. But modern no tillage only was born in 1962. My father, Harry Young, was the first farmer to use it commercially. And we'll talk about him and the history of it sometime just in the next few minutes. But this picture also points out that in, I think it was 3 years ago now, Columbia University, being funded by the Howard Buffett Foundation, came here to the farm to study the business plan of what we do in the 2000s for no-till farming. And they made that presentation to go specifically to the target of Ghana in Africa. So while you can see the picture here of a man who seems to be standing out in a weed patch, the idea of no tillage is worldwide, and even the Howard Buffett Foundation has seen fit to do a lesson plan for Columbia University. We've even had a visitor here as one of the students from Columbia University, Sinful Nathan, who grew up in poverty in southern India, but has advanced himself and is now sharing ideas like that with poor farmers in Indonesia. So it's a worldwide phenomenon, and I suppose it's one of the three largest adaptations of technology in agriculture today. One of the most photographed signs, at least in western Kentucky, is this one that you see on your screen now. And it references the point that my father and my uncle were some of the first, actually the first, to use modern no-tillage practices on a commercial farm. And that was put up and is just across the road from where Alexander lives now. This is a picture of my father and my mother. He was in the Army Air Corps in World War II. She was in the Navy, and they married during World War II. So this is their wedding picture back from 1943. This is a little more recent. My father passed away in 1988, but several years before he passed away, there was a video made by DuPont Chemical, and this is a still shot taken from some of that video, all about no tillage, which even in the 1970s was a new phenomenon. Two more Harry Youngs. My brother Harry and his son Harry are shown in front of their little tractor doing no tillage near Royal Center, Wisconsin. They have a farm there. He actually was a computer genius and lived just north of Chicago, but on the weekends he would go to his farm in Wisconsin, and this is one of the ways they did no-till. The tag team of no-tillage back in 1970s, particularly, were Dr. Shirley Phillips with the extension at the University of Kentucky in Lexington. He and my dad, who are shown here unveiling that historical marker, worked together in writing one book, and then my dad co-authored a second book about no-tillage back in the 70s. Dr. Phillips was a worldwide advocate of no-till, and my dad traveled quite a bit speaking and telling farmers about what we did here on the farm in western Kentucky. So it's just a picture. Many of these pictures will go back to history. And some of you may be so young that you don't remember a man named John Finley. In fact, I'd be very surprised if any of you have met him. While my dad was considered a pioneer, just like Daniel Boone was a pioneer, somebody had to tell him and them about the idea itself. Daniel Boone was told about Kentucky by a man named John Finley. If my dad were alive today, I think he would have said, let's remember the John Finleys in agriculture. And the one who actually told my dad about no-till was a man in Dixon Springs, Illinois, a man named McKibben. He had a small test plot in 1961. My dad saw it, said, hey, I can take that home and do that. So he took it, brought it home, and he had a local welding shop put together an old two-row mule-drawn planter that was parked in the fence row. So he pulled it out, stuck it under a small tractor. But the point of that slide, the John Finley and Daniel Boone connection, is this. There's always someone to thank to getting you to the point where you are now. And I think my dad would always be willing to say that not only Dr. Phillips, but Dr. McKibben and many others have brought us to this point. Actually, many of you may be familiar with a book called Plowman's Folly, which was published in the 1940s. And that gave the first idea that maybe plowing was not such a great idea. And we have copies of that. I hope you have read it yourselves. This is a picture of double crop soybeans from several different angles being grown in Kentucky years ago. A modern picture would look very similar to this. Our rotation has been pretty much the same for a long time: corn, soybeans, and winter wheat. We'll talk about cover crops later, I'm sure, and there may be questions about that. But our main cover crop is called wheat. After corn, we plant wheat. After the wheat is harvested in June the following year, we plant double crop soybeans. And the only time the soil does not have an actively growing crop is between the harvest of the soybeans and the planting of the corn in that following third year. So I'm still looking for the right mix on that. I hope to discover that someday. I'll let you know when we do. This picture, I talked about the original no-till planter. This is it. This is a picture of that mule-drawn planter pulled by a 140 Farmall tractor. You may not be old enough to remember such things, but that's what we used to use in tobacco and also to mow the yard. It was an all-purpose tractor for the 1950s and 60s. But if you'll notice something about that planter, you'll see that it has no closing wheels like a modern one does. It's just a flat wheel. It doesn't have really a furrow opener. It's just a slide that goes through the ground. It did not have coulters until it was made in the shop and the coulters were put up front. So while that did get the job done on the first 3/4 of an acre in 1962, so many advances have been made since then that this really is very much comparable to the Wright brothers plane versus a 747 today. But that's a picture of the original. This is the way planters looked in 1972. That was the year that my dad and Dr. Phillips introduced that first textbook, I guess you could call it, No Tillage Farming. And one of the first projects I had when I got out of the university and came home to farm was to build those large hoppers on top of the planter. They were to hold more soybeans so we could go more acres and not have to fill up as often. So we've spent quite a few days in the shop, bending and welding and so forth, but that was an unusual thing at the time. That's the way it looked in 1972. And then we'll fast forward to 1992. You can see that the hoppers got bigger and the planters got wider and horsepower was greater simply because we had more acres to produce. But again, double crop soybeans being planted in recently harvested wheat stubble. So let's talk about what we do now. That was the history lesson. How do we do it now? As you can see, if the picture is coming through for you, it's not what the 1900 farmer would consider a thing of beauty. In fact, some people call it farming ugly. But the farming of ugliness, I suppose you could say that the beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And the microorganisms beneath the soil surface think that's a beautiful field. They have things to eat and a place to grow, and they're not disturbed, and their life cycles are in place. So while it may not be beautiful to a landowner who likes to see bare dirt, it's very beautiful to the land itself. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, even if the question and answer session brings it about. The picture you see at the top of the screen right now was taken last Saturday here in Western Kentucky. That was the first corn that we planted for 2020. Alexander is driving that planter. We actually run 2 planters similar to that for corn, and we will use 3 planters for our double crop soybeans. simply because it's such a timely thing that it has to be done quickly in order to get the most benefit. The planter that you see there is a 1795 John Deere planter. There are 16 corn rows, and between each one of those rows is a splitter unit, as we call them, and they are let down in the ground when we plant soybeans. So the row spacing would be 30-inch rows on corn, 15-inch rows on soybeans. And we have 2 older models plus this one, so that's 3 total planters on the farm. And of course, everyone knows what the bottom picture is. That's a sprayer. We have gone all the way from a tank that's pulled behind a small tractor to a spray coupe to a sprayer now. What's the model number, Al, on the new sprayer?
R4038.
R4038 John Deere, 120-foot booms. The more acres you have to cover, the more volume you have to move, and they have developed nicely into that. I don't know if CRP is a big deal in your area or not, but it was at one time here. And this is one of the most embarrassing pictures ever taken on this farm. As we turned a neighboring farm back into crop production after it came out of CRP, we have a karst area, if you're familiar with that term. The limestone rock underneath dissolves and makes sinkholes. If you're going through an area that has been left to do for itself whatever it will for 20 years, and you're trying to turn it back into crop production, you're liable to find a sinkhole or two. Well, this is our big sprayer, and it did find a sinkhole. We actually got out. No one was hurt, but it's kind of embarrassing. We have a couple of guys who come up every year from Mexico to help us. And when something like this happens, they call me on the phone, and we speak in Spanish, of course, to them. But they'll say, "Boss, we have a little problem." And I know when they say that, what they really mean is, "Boss, you have a big problem." That was one of those phone calls that came in. All right, and what is this one supposed to be? A healthy dose of skepticism is not a bad thing. Just because someone calls themselves an expert, whether it's me or someone else, doesn't necessarily mean that what they're telling you is the truth. It may not be an intentional problem there, but I think it's good to try every new idea, just like these guys were college professors, I suppose, if you can see the Three Stooges thumbing a ride to get over to their college. And by the way, I'm not making light of education or professorial educational ability. My son, my youngest son, Jeffrey, is a professor at Murray State. Alexander and I both have postgraduate degrees, and it's important. But we need to base what we do on real facts, real data, not speculation, and certainly not false data. That's an important thing to remember, because one of the largest lessons I have learned as a farmer is that if you're not making a profit, you're not going to be in the business very long. I have said over and over again that a farmer who is not making a profit will soon be a former farmer. You can't just break even. That's like working for nothing. So the profit potential is necessary. And there are lots of people who would like you to believe things which will not be good for you or your soil. Speaking of which, everybody is probably familiar with this picture from the 1930s, the Dust Bowl. Thankfully, we've gotten away from that technology. They had 3 or 4 things right during that, but the one thing they had wrong was that dust mulch that they wanted to cover the soil with. We have since found out that the best mulch is plant residue, whether it's from the previous crop or from a cover crop. Some way you have to leave the soil unexposed to the elements, or if you don't learn from history, George Santayana said, you're doomed to repeat history. So let's not get back into that situation. In no tillage, I think we can get around that. One of the things that we have also added to this farm anyway, and I hope that you're part of that, is the water management aspect. Water management consists of getting rid of too much water when you have too much and putting on water when you don't have enough. And both of those elements are pictured here. The one on the left is not from Kentucky. I believe it's from Colorado, showing the circles of the center pivot irrigators. We have added several center pivots to our farming operation, and it has made a big difference in the profit picture on our farm. The picture on the right, of course, is tile drainage. We have some soil types that are necessary to use tile drainage, and you need to get rid of the water when there's too much of it, just as much as you need to use extra water when you don't have enough. Now, regulations get in the way, and the source of water gets in the way, and the different nutrients that escape the soil in the water can get in the way of what the total perfect picture would be. But working around those things, we've got to find a way of producing the food that's necessary to keep the world's population fed. And while we have too much corn in the market right now, there will be a time when we'll need that corn. And one way to make that corn, or any other crop for that matter, is to be sure that it has the right growing conditions, including the water. There's a picture of one of our center pivots. If you have those in Vermont or the northeastern United States, you're probably just as familiar as I am. But we have currently 18 systems on our farm, and we use those 18 systems on 20 circles. 2 of them are towable from one circle to another. We soon got away from that because it was labor intensive and it destroyed the crops to pull them away from one field into another. But the idea of water management is a very important one. This is one of our grain systems. We actually have 2 grain systems. One's being reworked now, but as you can see, if you're going to make grain and feed the world, you have to have a place to put it. You have to have a machinery in order to dry it and to move it and to haul it to market. Okay, so that's basically a rundown of what we do now. Let's take a minute. I think I've still got a few minutes. Let's talk about cover crops. Cover crops are a great thing. And if they are used properly, and if it's the right kind of cover crop, I think it's great. With the system and the rotation that we have in Western Kentucky, we're very limited as to the amount of time that the soil is left unprotected. And even when it is unprotected in that way, it's partially protected from the stubble that's left over from our double crop soybeans. So what I am on the search for, here's what I would really like to have, is something that I can plant either into the standing soybeans as they're growing, or immediately after those soybeans that can grow over winter and to be harvested as a cash crop the following spring before we plant corn. Now, you may be raising your eyebrows and saying that's impossible. And I've got to be frank with you, I haven't found it yet. But we have tried a number of different things in cover crops, from the Austrian winter peas to cereal rye to radishes. We've tried a lot of different things. None of them have quite fit the competitive advantage that we have for double cropping soybeans followed by corn. But I'm still looking. And if any of you have any ideas, I would love to hear from you. I want us to remember, and we're getting down close to the end of my presentation here, so I want us to remember that while we have discovered a lot in the last 50 to 60 years, the age of discovery is not over. I have 3 or 4 different ideas here that could be developed by some person, probably in the younger generation. One, of course, is CO2, the sequestration of nitrogen, or excuse me, of carbon. And, you know, we do that all the time. It's just a matter of profitability, and it just happens to coincide with the sequestration of carbon. It's called organic matter when it gets into the soil. But another one is hydrogen and nitrogen as they are mixed together. If someone could find a way to do that, and I'm speaking specifically of anhydrous ammonia or any nitrogen source, if you could do that without the tremendous energy requirements that are necessary to make what we make now, I think not only would you become rich, but you could also do a great favor to the world of agriculture. Fertilizer placement is a big idea. You need to put it where the roots can get to it. We haven't found the perfect way to do that yet, but I hope that we will as we go through the years. Genetic modification, while it may be a dirty word to some people, they talk about frankenfood and things like that. It has allowed us to get away from the huge mountains of herbicide that used to be used. And I think it really has a place in agriculture. I would really hate to see that disappear. And frankly, one that has not even hit the radar screen for most people is the idea of perennial crop production. Think about it for a second. If you could grow corn or any other crop the same way people grow grapes, by planting once and harvesting for 20 years, wouldn't that be the ultimate in no tillage? Wouldn't that be the ultimate in conserving the soil? And wouldn't that be the ultimate in being able to place the nutrients right next to where they need to be rather than having to use GPS and RTK? I think that's something that could be developed, but I don't know that anybody that's doing it. So those are some ideas that you might want to take with you. The question comes up, why do we do what we're doing? Well, I already talked about the profit motive, but they're actually in the world of farming or in life in general. I would say that there are 4 words that would represent what we're doing. The number one is production, and you have to have that. The second one is the profit motive, which I've talked about. The third one is the progeny. Alexander, who's sitting next to me, is the next generation on this farm. And then finally, posterity. So just like the 4-H clubs have 4 H's, I would like to use those 4 P's: production, profit, progeny, and posterity, to talk about what our goals are. 100 years from now, I won't be around. Alexander may not even be around. And those of you who are listening to me today may not be around. We've been told over and over that the only 2 things that last forever are the Word of God and the souls of men. But within the farming context, you need to be thinking of not about just today and not about just the market and not even about the coronavirus and the isolation that we have. You need to be thinking about the next generation and the one after that and the one after that. That's why we do what we do. This picture that I have up there on that slide is a neighbor of ours who knows better than to do what he did. This was taken on my way to the bank one day a few years ago. And the white that you see out in the field are not snowballs. Those are huge limestone rock. It didn't used to be that way. As they work the soil goes down, it gets into the creek, it ends up in New Orleans because it goes down the Ohio River and then down the Mississippi River. But they continue to do the same thing and they expose the bedrock. That's not a good idea. And they're not thinking about the future, not even about 10 years in the future. They're just thinking about what they're doing to get the crop out today. That's not the way we should be farming. And that's not the way our family intends to farm. We do what we do to conserve the soil. The future of agriculture then, as I said, is the next generation. There's 2 pictures of Alexander, one at work, one at rest. And here's my favorite crop. We have a corn, soybean, wheat rotation, but we also have children. These are my 5 surviving children. And they do all come home when it's possible, especially during June, because in June, we have to plant, we have to harvest, we have to haul, we do it all. When the wheat is harvested and the beans are planted and it's hauled to the dryer and put in the bin and hauled to market, it is all hands on deck. So with that in mind, we're looking at the future. Isn't that a pretty picture? I honestly couldn't tell you if that's a sun up or a sunset. Well, whatever it is, I think the future is bright for those of us who understand what the soil is trying to tell us. The soil is trying to say, help us, please, by taking care of us and allowing the things that make the soil besides the minerals to survive and to thrive. And that's why we do what we do. So with that, I'll bring that presentation to a close. And I will turn it back over to Catherine and Heather. Let me know what's next.
All right. Thanks, John. That was awesome. It was really wonderful and beautiful
Thank you.
pictures and beautiful family. Here's my son is right here next to me, and my video's not working today, but he was listening, and he said, "Do you think they're embarrassed that they put it that their dad put their picture up there?"
No, we're not.
No, I don't think so. I've used that picture before, and I think they're all happy with it.
He's only 7, so.
What's his name?
What's your name?
What's your son's name?
His name is Flint, as in Flint Rock or Flint Hills.
Flint. Hello, Flint. Glad to have you with us today. Welcome to Kentucky.
We've been to Kentucky. He's been to Kentucky a couple of times, actually.
Great.
Yeah. He taught me the capital of Kentucky because I thought it was probably like everyone else, Louisville. And he said, "No, it's Frankfurt." I said, "No, it's not."
Good for you, Flint.
Yeah. And we had to go to a meeting in Louisville, and we made a stop by Frankfurt to the state capitol, so he could see it. Stop. All right. Well, let's see if we have any questions here this morning. Somebody was asking if you had any issues with herbicide-resistant weeds.
Good question.
And if you do, how do you manage them?
Okay, the biggest way to handle anything that might be herbicide resistant is to find another herbicide. I say that tongue in cheek. But if you have multiple modes of action, and the agrochemical companies have allowed us to do that, then we have not found that is a real problem. I would say that the real problem in the southern United States and western Kentucky particularly, especially if you try to think about doing organic, is to get rid of the weeds in the first place. But the resistance to herbicides, assuming that you're willing to use multiple modes of action, has not been a problem.
Great. So if
you want me to get more specific, we can do that. I'm not really sure.
So you haven't really had an issue then with resistance?
Thankfully, the companies are allowed to introduce new chemicals and new modes of action. If we ever tried to rely strictly on, let's say, glyphosate, Roundup, if all we use was glyphosate, then you're going to have a problem. But if you put a residual chemical with glyphosate, it's like having 2 different sizes of wrenches in the same toolbox. You're able to use both of those wrenches to attack the similar problem, and you'll be much better off than trying to do it with one.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So, Catherine, I don't know if you put up the quick poll yet, but if you could do that, that would be great. If people can answer those questions. If you have more questions for John, please get them in the chat box. And John, I was wondering, do the cover crops help suppress the weeds? Have you noticed that? I mean, you're in a much warmer climate than we are, so I'm sure your weed and pest issues are more significant than ours, but just curious if the cover crops help.
2 weeds that well, 3 weeds, I'll talk about 3 of them briefly, that we have always seen through the years. They're Johnson grass, which you probably don't have in that area.
No.
Morning glories, which probably is a beautiful potted plant in that area. Down here, it's a weed. And the third thing was Italian ryegrass.
Oh.
Ryegrass was brought in a generation ago as a winter pasture for the cattle. And it unfortunately matures exactly like winter wheat. So it's difficult to control. We do have alternatives. Whole-on years ago, Axial now, Osprey, I believe, is used on ryegrass, Italian ryegrass. But it is an ongoing concern that needs to be dealt with. Johnson grass can be killed with glyphosate quite readily. But if you try to get into something like organic no-till in the southern United States, it will be a severe problem because it comes not only from seed, but rhizomes, and it has to be killed inside out rather than just as a surface application. And the same thing is true with vines. I mentioned morning glories as a vine. There are a lot of different kinds of morning glories, but even the honey vine milkweed and the wild cucumber and the big root morning glory, climbing milkweed, a number of those things in the South are a real challenge. And that's why I talked about multiple modes of action. And at the present time anyway, the difficulty in trying to find a way to do organically grown no tillage. The organic crops that are grown here are all tilled and cultivated and hoed. And as you know, that leaves the soil exposed. And that is not good on rolling terrain. It does, as I said, eventually end up in New Orleans. So we're still looking for a usable way to do organic. The prices are great. I'd love to be able to sell organic crops of any kind, but weed control is the big issue with that, at least in the South. Does that address the question you're looking at?
Yeah. Well, one question is, do you still have the Farm All 140?
I wish we did. I've been asked that a number of times. No. We got a zero-turn lawnmower, and that pretty well did away with the need for the Farm All 140. I've also been asked, do we have any part of the original two-row planter? No, we don't have that either. About 2 years after my dad developed that, he gave it to a neighbor who used it for a year and then put it in the scrap pile. So it's been gone for over 50 years now. I wish we did, but I don't.
Okay, so what is the next thing you're trying to tackle on your farm in 2020?
Well, in 2020, the biggest, I guess you could say, short-term challenge is the price of corn. If everybody would quit growing corn and would leave us as the only producer, that'd be great. But there's just a lot of it around. I failed to mention, but one of the things that local corn is used for is ethanol. I'm on the board of directors for a large cooperative elevator, which handles corn, soybeans, and wheat. We also own an ethanol plant for fuel, but with the coronavirus, we have changed a percentage of our production from fuel to hand sanitizer. And we're selling hand sanitizer now through that. And, there's always a diverse way of handling different crops. I'm amazed at the thousands of ways that the corn plant itself can be used. So the market has to take care of that. And as a result, hopefully the market will return. But that is outside of our direct control, obviously. The market does what it wants to do, and we just respond to it. On the farm itself, our immediate challenge is to finish planting corn and then to get on to wheat harvest in June. If you think about the intermediate challenge, that would be in getting irrigation on more acres, tiling on more acres, so that we can do that water management on as much as possible. We have looked at different alternatives to that. And as always, it's just a cost and benefit analysis, whether you get a good return on investment and, what can you expect to get from it. And it gets back to the market again. If the prices are low, you have a smaller return. So that would be our intermediate challenge. The long-term challenge would be a generational transfer. And people call that estate planning. It goes by a lot of different names. But we would like to be able for the business to be intact for future generations, and would also be controlled by those who are the ones who make their living from it. So as many of you probably understand, that's a challenge in itself for off-farm heirs and on-farm heirs to be treated equitably. I would say for the long term, that would be one of the biggest challenges. I think we have a pretty good handle on all three of those. The market, we're working on that. Won't give away any secrets, but you'll figure that out for yourselves. And the second one, getting the irrigation and the tiling in place is an ongoing thing. We're currently rebuilding one of our grain handling systems, and construction crews are at work day to day getting that done. And then the long-term thing, we've sat down and talked with our kids, and I think we have a good handle on that as well. So I hope that addresses what you're asking.
Yes, that was great. One last question, and then we'll be out of time. Do you have experience with strip till? Pluses and minuses versus no-till?
I didn't catch the word. Do I have experience with what?
Strip till.
Oh, strip till.
Yeah.
Yeah, some of our neighbors do that, and they're very successful. They're good farmers, intelligent, maybe more intelligent than I am. But I see the minimum disturbance of soil as the goal. In fact, my dad's idea of the perfect no-till planter would be one that operated like a sewing machine, that would come along and just insert the seed, cover it up, and not even have to put a coulter in front of the unit. So strip till has its place, I'm sure, and I know people who do it, but we have not specifically used that ourselves.
Okay. Well, we have one more quick question, I think. What is the source of your irrigation water? Deep well or surface?
I would love to be able to punch a hole in the ground and suck water out, but the substrata is limestone, and you can get 10 gallons a minute anywhere, but you can't get 500 gallons a minute with a well. If you go to the west of here in what's called the Jackson Purchase area of Kentucky, then they are able to do that. They have sand and gravel as underlying elements, and they just punch a hole and suck water. Where my wife grew up on a farm in north central Indiana, they can do the same thing. But here on our farm, we have two sources. There is a small spring in one area of our farm. We've dammed up the creek that flows out of that stream, and that's able to do about 200 acres of irrigation. The other one, we had to lay a large conduit from a nearby river. And we went, I think it was 4.4 miles. Got permission from the road department, from several neighbors, and laid a pipeline from the river over to a holding basin. From that holding basin, it's used to distribute water to the other pivots. So we are limited, and in this it's an expensive proposition to move water from the river to our farm. But that was the only way to go about doing it, and that's what we did.
Great. Well, it looks like we're at time. I don't know. I don't have my glasses on. Oh, we got a couple more minutes. We did have a comment. Thank you for rerouting your ethanol to hand sanitizer. It's definitely good use now. And if there's any last questions, please type them in quickly. Oh, here's something. If corn prices remain low, what crops could you switch to for better value or profit?
Good question. In fact, that's a $640,000 question. Anything that can be grown at a profit. If I could find another one, I would. The ones where the market is already developed in this area are corn, soybeans, wheat, and to a lesser extent, rye. If we could find something else, I would be open to that. Now, of course, hemp is moving in. Had a big push last year, but hemp prices are also low, and I'm sure there will be an equilibrium reached on it, and it will not take very many acres to reach that equilibrium. But I think the market itself, and this just shows my predisposition to free markets, I think the market itself over time will adjust. If you look at the ratio between the soybean price and the corn price, it is crying out that farmers should plant soybeans rather than corn at the moment. But at the same time, a year ago, it was saying don't plant wheat, and wheat has since rebounded because people are cooking at home and they want more flour, and you get the idea. The market itself can adapt. And if we have enough sense to follow the lead of the market, then even if we stay with a standard rotation of corn, wheat, and soybeans, and we price it at the proper time, I believe that it will always bring us a relative profit. And it's really difficult to outguess it, in my opinion. So that's not an exact answer. I wish I had a fourth alternative, but the marketing chain in this area is not such that we can do that.
Well, thank you very much. It was a pleasure to meet you. Thanks for sharing your story and history. It was really wonderful, and the photos were great, and the information was invaluable. Thank you so much, John, for
Thank you
today.
Yeah. And to all of you who are listening, God bless you. I wish you well through this difficult time, and maybe we'll look back on it and be able to see each other again in the future. I hope so.
Yes, me too. So thank you, everybody. Again, our next webinar is on Monday, and we'll be talking about cover crops and soybeans. If you're part of the No-Till Professional Development Program, you're welcome to stay on after the webinar. We have our office hours, and if you have questions for our group or a discussion you want to share, please stay on, and we'll be on for a little while after. Thanks, John. Thanks, Alexander. Have a great growing season, and we'll see you here.
Thank you.
Bye.